The day my daughter looked me in the eye and said this house was too much for me, something inside me cracked. She called it practical, said I couldn't keep up anymore, as if I hadn't spent my entire life keeping this family together. I stood in my own kitchen with papers in front of me, hearing her talk about nursing homes and trust funds, like I was already gone. That moment hurt in a way I can't even explain, but it was also the moment I realized I wasn't going to let them win. Stay with me till the very end, and let me know where you're watching from, so I can see how far the truth really spreads. My name is Margaret Walker. I'm 68 years old, a widow and a mother. And last month, my only daughter looked me in the eye in this very kitchen and told me this house was too much for me, that it was better if they handled it. She said it like she was doing me a favor, like my life and my home were just another chore she'd rather not deal with anymore. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the light through the lace curtains cast little shadows on the table I've sat at for almost 40 years. I'd just come in from the garden, wiping the dirt from my hands, when the front door opened without so much as a knock. Emily breezed in first, her heels clicking against the wood floor, followed by Travis, who stayed a few steps behind her, carrying a brown leather folder. She didn't even ask how I was, or notice the smell of bread still warm in the oven. She glanced around the room like she was already sizing it up for someone else, her eyes lingering on the cracked plaster and the scuffed baseboards. Then she smiled that tight little smile of hers and said they'd been talking about what was best for me. I stood there, holding my hands together, listening as she called it practical. Said it didn't make sense anymore for someone my age to manage a house this big. Her voice was calm like she'd rehearsed it, but the words cut straight through me. You're not getting any younger, Mom. You can't keep up with this place. That was the moment I felt my knees almost give out, though I kept my back straight and my mouth closed. The folder Travis set down on the kitchen table made a soft little thud, and I swear the sound of it still echoes in my head. Emily opened it with a flourish and began flipping through papers like I wasn't even there. She said they'd already called a realtor, already priced the house, already spoken to a lawyer about getting everything transferred into their names so they could take care of me. Her tone was polite but sharp, as if the polite part was just for show. She said they'd found a very nice retirement community outside of town, somewhere quiet with nurses and activities and all the care I'd need. Like I couldn't care for myself anymore. Like I was just another one of her errands waiting to be crossed off her list. I watched her lips move, but my ears started ringing, and all I could hear was the faint creak of the oak floor beneath my feet. My home. The place I raised her in. The place I built my whole life around. And she stood there, telling me it was too much for me now. Like I didn't matter. Like I was already halfway gone. I wanted to tell her no, to tell her to get out, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I looked down at the table at the neat stack of forms and signatures they expected from me. My hands shook just a little, but I kept them pressed flat against the edge of the table, holding on as tight as I could. Emily kept talking about how practical it was, how they'd take care of everything, so I wouldn't have to worry anymore. She didn't even see how much she'd already taken from me just by saying it. And Travis just stood there, arms crossed, not meeting my eyes like he was too embarrassed to watch, but not brave enough to speak up either. When she finally stopped, when the kitchen fell quiet again, except for the hum of the old refrigerator, she smiled at me. That same smile she used to give when she wanted something and already knew she was going to get it. And that's when it hit me harder than anything she'd said so far. This wasn't just about the house. It was about me, about how little she thought I was worth anymore. I don't even remember what I said to her then. Maybe nothing at all. I just remember staring at my hands on the table, feeling the blood drain out of my cheeks, wondering how a mother could love a child so much and still feel this alone. She pushed the pen toward me with a soft little click, her nails tapping against the paper. I remember how calm she sounded when she told me to sign, how easy she made it all sound. But nothing about it was easy. Not one damn thing. I looked up at her finally, and the words she'd said at the start came back to me like a slap. "This house is too much for you, Mom. It's better if we handle it." And all I could think as I stared at her was better for who? Because it sure as hell wasn't for me. I was only 39 when my husband died. He'd gone into work one morning at the mill like any other day, and by noon, he was gone, his heart giving out between shifts while he was still wearing his lunch pail on his shoulder. I barely remember the funeral, just the way the church smelled like lilies, and how small Emily's hand felt in mine as she stood there in her little black dress, silent and wide-eyed. After that, it was just the two of us. Emily was 10 and too young to understand how fast the bills piled up when there was only one paycheck left. I didn't let her see me cry at night, though she must have heard sometimes through the walls. I got up every morning before the sun packed her lunch and walked her to school before heading to my first job of the day. I cleaned houses, mostly starting with one on Jones Street that belonged to a woman who never bothered to learn my name. I'd scrub her baseboards on my hands and knees while she sipped coffee and chatted on the phone in the next room. Then I'd head across town to mop floors at an office building, making the linoleum shine while the rest of the world slept. I had a little spot at the end of the row between the man who sold peaches and the lady who knitted scarves. The regulars came to know me for my pecan pie and warm rolls, and for a few hours each Saturday morning, I felt like someone who mattered, even if it didn't last. There were nights when my feet ached so bad I couldn't feel them, but I'd still stand over the stove, stirring soup, or helping Emily with her homework. I sewed patches on her jeans so she could wear them another year, and told her stories while I brushed her hair just to keep her smiling. Every dollar I earned went into keeping her fed and clothed, keeping her from feeling the holes I carried in my own pockets. I remember once the winter she turned 12, she wanted a coat just like the one her friend had. It took me 3 months of saving tips from cleaning bathrooms to afford it. And when she opened the box on Christmas morning and threw her arms around my neck, I thought maybe all the work was worth it. I carried that quiet pride like a secret. Even when my hands cracked and bled from bleach, even when my knees gave out from scrubbing tile, I'd tell myself it was all for Emily. Every time I took another job or skipped another meal, I'd picture her future the way she'd grow up strong and confident, never having to feel the way I did. But sometimes, late at night, when the house was still and dark, I'd sit in the kitchen and stare at my own reflection in the window. I'd wonder what it might feel like to rest just for a little while, to feel like more than someone whose worth was measured by what she could give. There were moments I felt resentful, though I never said a word. Like the day I came home from cleaning 3 houses and found Emily complaining about the dinner I'd left on the stove. Or the time she rolled her eyes at the worn shoes I'd bought her before school started too young to understand they'd cost me 2 weeks of lunches. Even so, I never let the bitterness show. I smiled through the exhaustion, through the quiet sting of being overlooked. I tucked her into bed and promised her things would get better. I believed it too, or at least I wanted to. This house was the one thing I managed to hold on to through all of it. Every dollar I scraped together went into paying it off so she'd always have a roof over her head. Every time I passed through that front door after a long day, I'd feel a little rush of relief knowing it was ours, knowing no one could take it from us. When I planted roses by the front steps or painted the shutters in spring, I'd imagine her bringing her own family here someday. I imagined her sitting at this same kitchen table, telling me about her day, letting me hold her babies the way I once held her. I held on to that dream even as she started to pull away. Even when she stopped coming home for dinner, stopped calling just to say goodnight. I told myself it was just part of growing up that she'd come back around once she understood everything I'd done for her. So I worked and I waited. Year after year, shift after shift, folding myself smaller just so she could reach higher. And I told myself it was enough. that she was worth it, that she'd see me one day, really see me. But standing in this kitchen, with her now watching her push those papers across the table, I couldn't help but wonder if all those sacrifices really meant anything to her at all. Or if to her, I'd never been more than a tired old woman who cleaned up after everyone else. It started with little visits that didn't feel much like visits at all. Emily and Travis would pull up in their shiny black SUV and walk up the steps like they were walking into a stranger's house. She'd barely hug me before looking around, her eyes scanning the walls and floors like she was inspecting damage. The first time she wrinkled her nose at the living room curtains and said they looked dusty, asked if I even bothered to clean them anymore. Travis just stood by the door with his arms crossed, his eyes on the ceiling like he couldn't believe it was still standing. I laughed it off and said I'd get to the curtain soon, though my chest burned as I said it. The next time she stopped by, she stood by the garden and frowned at the roses I'd been pruning earlier that morning. She asked why I bothered planting anything anymore when nobody came to see them. Then she said it might be better to dig them up and let the grass grow over so it would be easier for the next owners to mow. One afternoon, she stood in my kitchen, her arms folded tight against her chest, and called my table outdated. She said nobody even made chairs like mine anymore, and maybe I'd feel better if I just let her help me pick out something more modern. I told her I liked my old table just fine. She just smirked and said she figured I'd say that. Sometimes it was Travis who spoke up, though he never looked me in the eye when he did. He'd say things like, it was a shame how much the house was losing value just sitting here. Or that it must be hard for me to keep up with repairs now that I was getting on in years. The words always sounded casual, but they stung worse because of how easily he said them. The more they came around, the less I looked forward to seeing them. Every visit felt like another inspection, another reminder of how little they thought of me. They never sat down to drink coffee with me anymore. They never asked how I was or told me what was going on in their lives. They just came and walked through the house, whispering to each other and shaking their heads at everything they saw. I started noticing the way Emily would trail her fingers along the windowsills as if checking for dust. The way she'd open the cabinets and glance inside like she was already imagining where she'd put her own dishes. Once I even caught her standing in my bedroom doorway, staring at the quilt on my bed as if it offended her somehow. It was like they couldn't see me anymore. Like I was just a shadow in the corner of a house they already thought of as theirs. And the more they ignored me, the smaller I felt shrinking into the wallpaper, while they walked through my life as if it belonged to them. After one visit, I sat at the kitchen table long after they left, just staring at the papers they'd left behind. Notes about market value retirement homes and trusts written in Travis's neat little handwriting. I folded them back into their envelope and shoved it into the drawer by the fridge, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, as I watered the flowers by the steps, I caught myself thinking, maybe Emily was right. Maybe the house was too much for me now. Maybe I was just fooling myself, clinging to something I couldn't take care of anymore. But then I looked at my roses, the ones I'd planted when Emily was still in school, the ones I'd kept alive through storms and dry summers, one careful cut at a time. And I felt something bitter rise in my throat, something heavy that sat there long after I went to bed. Each visit left me with a little less of myself, a little less pride in what I'd built, a little more doubt about whether anyone had ever really seen how hard I'd worked for all of it. It wasn't just the house they were picking apart. It was me, and every word they said, every dismissive glance felt like another little cut. Small enough to ignore if it were only once, but sharp enough to bleed when it happened again and again. It was late afternoon when I heard their car pull into the driveway. The sound of tires on gravel was sharp and final, like the crack of a door closing somewhere deep inside me. I set down my watering can and wiped my hands on my apron, already bracing for whatever they had come to say this time. Emily walked in first, as usual, her heels clicking against the floor with quick, determined steps. Travis followed a few paces behind, carrying a thick manila folder tucked under his arm. They didn't even bother with small talk. No hug, no hello. Emily went straight to the table and pulled out a chair, smoothing her skirt as she sat. She glanced at me, her eyes colder than I'd ever seen them, and said it was time we all stopped pretending. Travis laid the folder down in front of her without a word and took his place by her side. She opened the folder slowly, almost delicately, as if what she was about to say was some kind of gift. Her voice was steady when she said they'd spoken to a lawyer, to a doctor, to a realtor. Everything was ready, she told me. All that was left was my signature. I couldn't take my eyes off her hands as she slid the papers across the table toward me. Her nails were painted a pale pink and gleamed in the light from the window. She tapped the top sheet, her tone soft but sharp, telling me this was what was best for everyone. I stared down at the page in front of me, the words swimming in my vision as she explained what each one meant. Guardianship. Sale of property. Transfer of assets. It was all there in neat black ink, the end of everything I'd worked for, spelled out in tidy little paragraphs. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears as she spoke calm and reasonable, as if this was all perfectly normal. She said the house was too much for me now. She said it didn't make sense for me to stay here alone. She said I couldn't keep up anymore and shouldn't have to try. It wasn't just the words that hurt. It was the way she said them, so sure of herself, so certain she was right. As if my life, my home, my very being was just another problem for her to solve. I looked up at her, then really looked, and for the first time I saw her not as my little girl, but as someone I barely recognized. Her face was hard, her mouth set in a line I'd never seen before. And next to her, Travis stood silent, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the floor. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy. My fingers shook as I reached for the papers, then pulled back before touching them. In that moment, something inside me cracked. Not loud, not sudden, but deep. Like a piece of me broke quietly and would never quite fit back the same. I realized then that they didn't see me anymore. Not really. Not as a mother, not as a person. To them, I was just another burden, another inconvenience to be managed and put away. And as I sat there, staring down at the papers they expected me to sign, I felt my heart break in a way I didn't know it could. That night, the house felt heavier than it ever had. The air was thick and still pressing against my chest, no matter how deep I breathed. I sat at the kitchen table long after Emily and Travis left, staring at the papers they'd pushed in front of me, my hands folded tight to keep from shaking. The clock ticked on the wall, each second louder than the last, as though it was counting down something I couldn't name. The folder lay where they had left it, the corner of it just barely hanging off the edge of the table. I couldn't bring myself to touch it again, afraid of what it might mean if I did. When the quiet became too much, I stood and wandered the house like a ghost. My fingers brushed the door frames and the backs of chairs, tracing familiar grooves and chipped paint, each one a little piece of my life. Every corner, every crack held some memory I'd fought to keep alive, but now it all felt fragile, as if a single signature could sweep it away. I found myself standing in the hallway mirror, staring at the woman looking back at me. The lines in her face seemed deeper, somehow her eyes darker, more tired. For a long moment, I just stood there, searching that reflection for the person I used to be. The tears came slow at first, then faster until they ran hot down my cheeks. I pressed my palms to the cool glass and let myself cry, letting all of it pour out. The hurt, the betrayal, the years of sacrifice they'd never seen, all of it breaking loose in the stillness of the night. But somewhere in the middle of all that grief, another feeling began to rise. It started small, almost nothing, but steady and sharp like a thorn in my chest. I realized then it wasn't just sadness I was feeling. It was anger, too. I wiped my face and stood up straighter, looking hard at myself in that mirror. My voice was low when I spoke, but I heard it clear enough to believe it. If they think I'm too old to fight, they're about to learn who raised them. The thought settled into me like a stone at the bottom of a river, solid and certain. I didn't know yet how I'd do it or what it would take, but I knew I wasn't done. Not yet. I walked back into the kitchen and turned on the light, the faint hum of the bulb filling the silence. The papers were still there, waiting, but this time I didn't look at them with fear. I looked at them with something closer to resolve. I poured myself a glass of water and sat back down at the table, my mind already moving. Names and numbers came to me, people I could call, questions I could ask. There had to be someone who knew what to do, someone who could help me keep what was mine. As the hours crept by, the weight on my chest began to lift. I thought about Emily's face when she slid those papers toward me, so sure I'd just give up. And I thought about how sweet it would feel to prove her wrong. By the time the sun began to rise, spilling soft light across the floor, I was ready. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't signing a damn thing. The next morning, I woke up with a strange calm in my chest. The anger was still there, quiet but steady, like coals left burning after a fire. I stood at the kitchen sink, staring out at the garden, and made up my mind that whatever it took, I wasn't going to let them take my home without a fight. After lunch, I called the number of a lawyer one of my neighbors had mentioned months ago. His name was David Reese, and he answered on the second ring, his voice low and deliberate. When I told him what my daughter and her husband were trying to do, there was a pause on the line before he asked if I could come in that afternoon. David's office was on the second floor of an old brick building downtown. He was younger than I expected, with sleeves rolled to his elbows and a sharp look in his eyes. He shook my hand firmly and told me to sit, then asked me to explain everything from the beginning. I told him about the visits, the comments, the papers they wanted me to sign. I told him about how they'd spoken to doctors and lawyers already, how sure they seemed that I'd just give up. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and studied me for a moment before speaking. He said there were laws to protect people in my position, but we had to be smart. He asked if I had a medical evaluation to prove I was of sound mind. When I said no, he pulled a card from his desk and handed it to me, telling me to call the doctor he trusted most and schedule an appointment right away. David explained that it was important to gather more than just proof of my own capacity. We needed evidence of what Emily and Travis were trying to do. He said it wasn't just about stopping them. It was about showing anyone who mattered exactly what kind of people they were. He opened a drawer and pulled out two small devices no bigger than my thumb. He called them discreet home recorders and told me how to place them in my kitchen and living room where they'd pick up everything. He showed me how to use the voice memo app on my phone if I needed to record them when they thought we were alone. I sat there holding the little recorder in my hand, feeling a kind of power I hadn't felt in years. David told me it wasn't about revenge. It was about standing up for myself and making sure no one mistook my love for weakness again. Love and weakness are not the same thing, he said, his eyes meeting mine. You've spent your whole life loving them. That doesn't mean you have to let them walk all over you. That stayed with me. Long after I left his office and walked back to my car, I kept hearing his voice in my head. Love and weakness are not the same thing. The next few days, I worked quietly, moving through my home with new purpose. I hid the recorders in plain sight where they blended into the furniture. I made sure my phone was charged and close by whenever they came over. And I called the doctor David recommended and made an appointment for the very next morning. When I sat in the doctor's office later that week, I felt almost nervous under the bright lights and questions. But I kept thinking about David's words and sat up straighter. I answered every test clearly and calmly, and when he handed me the signed evaluation at the end of the hour, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Back at home, I tucked the paper into a folder with David's card and kept it in the top drawer of my dresser. Every night, I'd open it and look at it before bed just to remind myself of what I was working toward. Emily and Travis came back that weekend unannounced as always. This time, I was ready. My phone was already recording in my apron pocket when they stepped through the door. Emily didn't even bother to smile as she started in about the house again, this time adding that she and Travis had found a buyer willing to pay in cash if we moved quickly. I stayed quiet and let her talk. When she slipped and said something about how easy it would be once I was finally out of the way, my fingers tightened around the phone in my pocket. By the time they left that evening, I had everything I needed. I sat down at the table with a cup of tea and played the recording back just to hear the proof for myself. The sound of Emily's voice saying those words made my chest ache and my hands shake, but it also made me smile. I called David first thing Monday morning. When I told him what I'd gotten, he chuckled softly and said we were building a solid case already. Then he told me to stop worrying and let him handle the rest. That night, as I watered my flowers and watched the sun slip behind the trees, I felt a sense of quiet strength settle into me. I wasn't done yet, not even close. And for the first time in a long time, I believed in myself again. It was a Sunday afternoon when I saw their car turn onto my street. The sun was high and warm, spilling across the front steps, where I stood trimming my roses. I didn't hurry to meet them this time. I stayed where I was and watched as Emily climbed out of the passenger side with a big smile that didn't reach her eyes. Travis followed her carrying another folder and a bakery box like an offering. They walked up the path side by side, her heels crunching over the gravel, his gaze fixed on the ground. I wiped my hands on my apron and nodded as they came closer, feeling my pulse slow into something steady and unshakable. Emily leaned in and kissed my cheek, as though nothing had ever happened. She said she was sorry for how tense things had been lately, that she just wanted what was best for me. I could see her glance past me to the house like she was already imagining how she'd decorate it. I stepped aside and invited them in the smell of chamomile tea already filling the kitchen. They sat at the table, Emily smoothing her skirt and laying her hand on top of Travis's as though to prove they were a team. Her eyes darted to the papers he carried and then back to me. I brought out 3 teacups and poured slowly, letting the steam rise between us. Emily started talking almost immediately. She said they'd found the perfect retirement home for me. It was close by with nurses and activities, and even a garden I could tend. She said she'd already booked a tour for next week. I nodded politely and set her tea in front of her. Then I turned to Travis and did the same. His hands were tight around the folder, his knuckles white. I sat down at the head of the table, folded my hands, and let them keep talking. Emily said she knew how hard this must be for me, that sometimes it was better to let the younger generation handle things. She called me strong but tired and said she just wanted me to be safe. I took a slow sip of tea and let her words hang in the air. When she finally stopped talking, I smiled softly and thanked her for her concern. Then I said there was something I wanted to show them. I stood and went to the sideboard where I'd tucked the folder David had prepared. The weight of it in my hands felt solid and right. I came back to the table and laid it in front of me, flipping it open one page at a time. First was the medical evaluation. I slid it toward Emily so she could see my name printed clearly at the top, with the doctor's signature certifying my full mental competence. Her smile faltered just a little as she scanned the page. Next, I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen and let the recording play the sound of her voice filling the kitchen. Her words from last week, cold and sharp. How easy it would be once I was finally out of the way. How they could sell the house and move on with their lives. Travis's face went pale and Emily's hand dropped from his. She stared at the table like the wood grain could save her. I turned off the recording and set the phone down next to the medical report. Then I opened the last envelope and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. A formal notice drafted by David warning them of pending legal action for attempted elder exploitation and coercion. The kitchen was so quiet, I could hear the clock ticking above the stove. Emily's lips parted like she was about to speak, but no sound came out. Travis cleared his throat and stood, but then sat right back down when I lifted my eyes to meet his. I spoke calmly, my voice low but even. I told them I knew exactly what they'd been trying to do. I told them I was not their burden, not their victim, and certainly not their retirement plan. Emily finally looked up at me, then her face red, her eyes wide with something between shame and fear. Travis just stared at the notice in silence, his shoulders sinking lower by the second. We stayed that way for what felt like a long time. Then I stood and told them they should leave. David would be in touch with next steps. They didn't argue. Emily gathered her purse with trembling hands, and Travis tucked the folder under his arm like it might still protect him. They walked out without another word, the screen door slamming softly behind them. I sat back down at the table and wrapped my hands around my tea, feeling the heat seep into my palms. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Not heavy or suffocating, but full of something lighter. Justice. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. And I knew I'd won. The weeks after that Sunday were quiet in a way that felt almost strange. Emily and Travis didn't come back to the house. Not a single call, not a single knock at my door. Word must have gotten around town about what they tried to do, because even my neighbors started watching them differently, a little colder than before. David handled everything from there. He worked with the district attorney to settle the matter without dragging me into court. Emily and Travis avoided jail time, but they weren't spared the humiliation. They were ordered to perform community service at a senior center across town. I heard later they had to clean floors, serve meals, and escort residents to their appointments. I didn't watch, but I didn't have to. The thought of them wiping down tables and pushing wheelchairs was enough to bring me a quiet kind of satisfaction. At home, I let myself exhale. The house felt like mine again, every corner, a little brighter, now that I knew it was safe. The garden started blooming again too, almost as if it could feel the difference. Roses and wildflowers opened in the sun, and the air smelled sweeter when I stood on the porch each morning. I started keeping the gate unlocked during the day, and little by little, people began stopping by. Some were neighbors who wanted to say they'd heard what happened, and they were proud of me. Others were women I didn't know who'd heard through church or word of mouth. One woman brought me a pie and sat at my kitchen table crying as she told me her son was pressuring her to sign her name to something she didn't understand. Another showed me papers she'd been too afraid to open. I listened to all of them. I kept a stack of business cards from David by the door. Whenever someone left, I'd press one into their hand and tell them the same thing he once told me. Love and weakness are not the same thing. Some days, when the afternoons stretched long and quiet, I would sit by the window with a cup of tea and reread the letters that started arriving from my grandchildren. At first, they were short, just a few lines written in uneven handwriting saying they missed me. Then more came. Notes tucked inside drawings of flowers and hearts. One said they couldn't wait to see my roses again. Another asked if I would teach them how to bake bread like I used to. I wrote back to each of them, folding my letters carefully and sealing them with a little smile. I told them I would always be here when they were ready, that the garden was waiting for them just as it always had. Evenings became my favorite time of day. I would sit on the porch and watch the light soften across the yard. The quiet no longer felt heavy, but full of possibility. The house felt alive again, and so did I. Sometimes, when I pass the hallway mirror, I stop and look at myself the way I used to. I see the same woman who raised a daughter on her own and worked herself raw to give her everything. But I also see someone stronger now, someone who learned she didn't have to keep giving pieces of herself away to feel worthy. There's a peace that comes with knowing you stood up for yourself when no one else would. A kind of healing that runs deeper than anger. I still plant roses by the front steps. I still bake bread on Saturdays for the neighbors. And I still wake up every morning with my back straight and my heart steady, knowing this house, this life are still mine. And when the next letter arrives in the mailbox with my granddaughter's shaky handwriting on the envelope, I hold it to my chest before opening it. Then I smile because I know the garden will welcome them back when they're ready. And so will I. If you've made it this far, I hope you take one thing with you. You are not a burden. No matter what anyone tells you, no matter how much they sigh or roll their eyes or talk over you, like you don't matter anymore, you have every right to stand your ground and protect what you've worked for. I spent so many years believing love meant letting myself come last, that if I just gave and gave, it would be enough to earn respect. But love without respect is nothing, and it took me almost 70 years to learn that lesson. If you're sitting in your own kitchen right now, staring at a stack of papers someone else told you to sign, I hope you stop and remember this. You do not have to give up what is yours just to make someone else comfortable. Your home, your dignity, your peace. Those belong to you. Standing up for yourself does not make you selfish. It makes you strong. And it reminds everyone around you that love is not weakness, even if they try to tell you otherwise. I know it isn't easy. It never is. But I promise you, the first time you look in the mirror and see someone who didn't back down, you'll know it was worth it. So don't let anyone talk you into thinking your life is already over. Don't let anyone make you feel small in your own home. You have a right to take up space in this world, no matter your age, no matter your story. And if you ever doubt it, just remember me. Remember the roses still blooming by my front steps and the light pouring through my kitchen window. Remember that even when they thought I would fold, I stood tall. You are not their burden. You are not their victim. And you are most certainly not anyone else's plan for an easier future. This is your life. Protect it. You're stronger than you think.